Hi, this is Phil at Simply Rhino, and in today's video I'm going to take a look at a simple product design rendering. I'll be using Rhino for Mac and KeyShot for Mac and concentrating specifically on creating textures, mapping and labels using this example of a home assistant. This is the starting point of our exercise in Rhino. It's a relatively simple model of the Home Assistant, and all of the major components have been placed onto separate Rhino layers. You'll notice that there is no detail on the speaker grille, the top plate or the buttons. We'll add all of this detail inside of KeyShot. So from Rhino I'm going to run my KeyShot 7 render command. This will open KeyShot and push this geometry into the KeyShot environment. Okay, once we're inside of KeyShot, I'm going to go to my cameras and choose the free camera, and I'm just going to manipulate the view. One of the things that I want to do is to make sure that I rotate about the cylindrical shape rather than the whole of the geometry. To do this, I can go to camera, I can choose camera target, I can click on the top plate, select done, and now I'm going to rotate about the cylindrical geometry. Okay, I'm going to go to lighting, I'm going to choose product mode, I'm going to go to my environments on the left, and I'll go to studio environments and basic, and I'll choose a contrasty startup environment. In my environment tab on the right, I'm going to change the background to a color, and I'm going to choose a dark gray, and I'm going to turn on the occluded ground shadows and the ground reflections. Then I'm going to go to the scene and going to go to the top level of the scene, go to my materials and plastic, and I'm going to apply a hard rough plastic to the top level of the model, so everything has the same material. I'll right click on the top level here, go to material, and I'll edit this material, and I'm just going to reduce the roughness slightly, and I'll just go back to the environment and just move these highlights slightly by rotating the environment, and I'll go into camera and I'll create a new camera, and I'll save that camera, and I'll just call this render 1. And we'll lock that view. Okay, this has just been my default view whilst I'm setting up the materials, and I can switch between render 1 and free camera. Okay, so first of all I'm going to take a look at creating the speaker grille. Now if I go to my metal materials and I go to, for example, aluminium, you will see that there are some meshes already in here, and this example is a 10mm hexagonal mesh. I'm going to start with this material. Most of the mesh materials are similar and they can be configured and changed once you have placed the material. So I'm going to now expand the model, and I'm going to go to speaker grille, and I'm going to select the speaker grille part, and I'm going to drag my rough aluminium mesh onto the speaker grille. Okay, so as its name suggests, this puts a 10mm hexagonal mesh onto my speaker grille. Now obviously this is way too big for what we need at the moment, and also if I switch camera and go to the free camera, you'll see that as I rotate here, you'll see that this mesh is not mapped correctly. Indeed, this will be using a box mapping by default, and we need to change that to a cylindrical mapping so that it matches the shape of the object that we're trying to map. So from my scene, if I right click on the part in question, select material and edit material, I can go to textures and I can change the mapping style in here. So I'm going to choose cylinder and I'm going to map by part, and I'm going to select move texture from here. So here I can choose to map either on the model or the part. Obviously I chose part up here, so part is selected here. I'm going to then choose whether to fit the notional cylinder to the x-axis, the y-axis, or of course more usefully in this case the z-axis, and you'll see the notional cylinder that is used to map the object. Okay, so I'll accept this as a starting point. So now when I rotate, you will see that the texture maps correctly. So now I can go in and edit the texture itself. So the mesh material or the mesh texture is a pre-built KeyShot texture, and I have several options inside of here. So if we just minimize clipping and mapping here, and I'll take a look at shape and pattern. So you'll see here that I can change the shape from hexagon to pentagon, triangle, circle, etc. So I can change the shape here, and I can change the size of the mesh here with width and height. This is the size of the holes in the mesh, and you'll see that by default the width and the height are locked together. And if I move this slider here, you'll see the size of the holes reduce. And further down here in pattern spacing, I can change the method by which these are patterned. So this is the patterning of the spacing, and I can choose the gap between the spacing. Okay, so this gives you plenty of control over this type of material. So I'm going to set the shape to be fairly small, 1.25 millimeters, and I'm going to set the gap between the space to be small as well, about 1 millimeter, maybe just a little bit more than this. And as I wait for this to regenerate, you'll start to see this mesh appear. Now if I just zoom in to the bottom of the mesh here, let's take a closer look at how this material is actually made. So you'll see in textures here there are two major components here, a bump map and an opacity map. And although I want to use a hexagonal mesh in the end, I'm actually going to change to a circular pattern here, and I'm just going to increase this just so we can see a little better what is happening with the pattern here. So I'll just wait for this to regenerate, and what you'll see is that the mesh has transparent areas, and you can see the shadows underneath on the material underneath the mesh from that, and you can also see the return edge on the mesh, so you can see the mesh elements that are at 90 degrees to the side here, and you can also see that there is an impression of some depth around the edge of the holes. And the way that this is created is as follows. So if I uncheck the opacity map first of all here, and again wait for this to regenerate, we'll see the bump map. Now the bump map is giving us the impression of that bit of depth around the edge of the hole. And of course if I go into bump, I can change that bump height, and I can move that from a negative to a positive should I wish, but obviously I want a negative bump here, and I don't really want to overdo this, but I just want to give the impression that there's some that the edges of the holes are receding. Okay, if I turn off the bump and just turn on the opacity, you'll see this is just a straightforward opacity map. The areas on the map where we have the holes drop out of the material and allow us to see what's underneath the material. And you put the two together and we have a much more three-dimensional representation of the mesh. Okay, now this is set up as standard in this material, but if we want to create our own materials, our own mesh materials inside of KeyShot, then we can use this metaphor to create the material. So I'm going to go back to this now and I'm going to re-establish my hexagonal mesh. I'm going to change the shape, width and height to as it was before, and the pattern spacing. If I want to change the color of this mesh, then I can go to material properties, and rather than using a measured material, the measured metal type has some preset metals in here, and I was using aluminium here to start off with. I can change measured to color, and I can choose, for example, a darkish grey here, and I can play with the roughness, and I can create a fairly convincing metal mesh. And you'll see that as this regenerates, this is starting to look nice and realistic now, and we're getting some really nice shadows underneath the mesh, all kind of giving the impression that this mesh is real. Now, of course, it's way easier to do this inside of KeyShot than to do this in Rhino, and we don't have the overhead of all the polygons in the Rhino render mesh that we would need to represent this as a surface or a solid. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my camera and re-establish the render 1 view and just take a look at the overall material. So what I'm going to do now is to save this mesh material. So I'll create a new folder and I'll call this Home Assistant. Okay, and then I'll go to my material for the mesh and I'll call this Hex Mesh Black, and save this to my Home Assistant folder. Okay, and it appears here. So what if now we wanted to have a mesh material for which there wasn't an existing pattern inside of KeyShot? In this case, we'd need to build our own material, and this is fairly straightforward. So first of all, I'm going to take a look at the image that I'm going to use. I'm just showing this in preview in Mac. This is a tileable image of a woven mesh texture, and this is a color image, and it's not a perfect image, but it's good enough to demonstrate the method of making the material. This is being saved down as a PNG file, and the important thing about this is that the overall lighting of the image is consistent and the image is tileable, so that when you place the image left to right, top to bottom, you won't see the join between the edges. So this is the image we're going to use inside of KeyShot for a material. So I'll switch back to KeyShot, and first of all what I'm going to do is to go to the scene and locate the speaker grill, and I'm going to go to my paint materials and I'm going to use a matte black paint for the speaker grill, and this will be the sort of starting point for my custom material. So if I right click on speaker grill here, material, and edit material, I'm just going to reduce the roughness of this slightly, and then I'm going to go to textures, and you'll see here I can load a color texture, a bump texture, and an opacity texture. So first of all I'm going to load the color texture, So if I enable the checkbox here, I will be taken to the file browser and I can find my mesh file and open this up. And this applies the mesh image onto the object. Now once again, the default proposition for this is going to be box mapping, and we'll look to change that in a moment. But first of all, even if you're not going to use the color map and you're only going to use the bump and the opacity map, then initially when you're setting up the material, using the color map sometimes makes it much easier to scale and place the material. So I'll change the mapping to cylinder. I'll go to move texture, center this around the part and choose Z, and then accept the result of this. And then under size and mapping, I'll be able to adjust the size of the mesh. Now obviously the size I'm getting here is the size of the original image. So the size of the original square or rectangular image relates to this. So if you have a specific size in mind and you know the scale of your image, then you can work backwards from these settings. So again, in camera here, I'm going to switch to free camera and I'm going to just now zoom in so I can see a little more what's going on with the mesh. So we just have a color texture on here at the moment, and if I go back to material, if I want to use the same texture for bump and opacity, I don't really need to load these in again. I can hold down the option button, hold down left mouse and drag. Okay, and I can create the bump and the opacity map with these. And I'll just let this regenerate for a moment. And now you can start to see the transparency now that's created by the opacity map. You can see the underlying material, we can see the mesh is returning along the bottom edge. Now I don't need this color map, but I'm going to use some element of this. But if I turn the color map off and again wait for the result to regenerate, you'll see the result looks acceptable. Using the color map means that I can capture an extra bit of life in the mesh, and although obviously this is too much at the moment, what I can do is to go back to the properties of the material and I can go to color, and you'll see here that the little preview of the image here is overwriting the base color of the material. Now if I expand color here, you'll see I can use this button here which is called blend with color, and I can blend the image with this color. And if I make this a sort of a fairly darkish gray, then I'm going to see little bits of the image and little bits of this color, and this is going to give me a slightly livelier mesh than I would get if I didn't use any elements of this material. This is purely a personal thing. There is, you know, you can play with this, but I just think in this case it makes the mesh look a little bit more interesting. So I'll go back to my camera and go back to the render 1 view and wait for this to regenerate. Okay, so that's starting to look somewhere on the way to being right now. So I'm going to save this material. And I'll save this as woven mesh. And I'll also save this into my Home Assistant folder. Okay, so that's gone into there. Okay, and I'm just going to now quickly render out a couple of images showing the detail of the mesh with the hex mesh and the woven mesh. So this is the render of the woven mesh. You can see that around here now the transparency or the opacity is looking really nice. We can see the sort of folded edge along the bottom. A couple of things that we can see on here, however, is that you can see that there's a couple of bands along here, and this is probably due to some uneven lighting on the actual source image itself that was used for the mesh. And this is one of the disadvantages, I guess, of using an image for the texture, is that you really need to make sure that that image is as optimized as possible to reduce any chance of any sort of banding or patterning appearing on the image, as you can make out on this image here. And if we compare this to the render of the hexagonal mesh, of course this mesh is a pattern that's created inside of KeyShot. This is much sharper in this instance, and you see things like the shadows, of course, have resolved slightly better as a result of that. Both of these results are acceptable, but probably the hexagonal mesh here is what I'm going to use to go forward in this particular example. So if we now go back into KeyShot, let's now choose the hex mesh for our mesh, and let's now take a look at the top area. And I'm going to look first of all at putting the icons and the text onto the buttons. Before I do this, I need to set my view to a top view. So I'll go to my camera tab, I'll choose top view and zoom in. And then I'm going to set the camera target to the top plate and continue zooming. And at the moment I have the cable exiting in this direction, and this of course is the back of the product, so I want to rotate the image around 180 degrees. So in this setting here, azimuth, I'm going to remove the minus symbol from the 90 degrees setting, and this will flip round 180 degrees. Just zoom in a little more, and then I'll add a new camera for this, and I'll save this as top plate. Okay, before I lock this, I'll just zoom in a little more, and then we'll lock this view. Okay, so let's first of all look at adding the symbols and the text onto these 4 buttons. So I'll go to my scene, I'll expand buttons, and I'll pick the first button over here. Now of course this will have a material that is shared by lots of the other components. So if I right click onto this button and I go to material, I can unlink the material. This means that I can change this material without changing all the other materials that share the same name. Then I right click again and I go to material and I edit the material. Now we saw before that if we wanted to apply a texture across the whole of the material, then we'd use the texture slot here. If we want to apply a texture or an image onto part of the material, then we use labels. Now labels in other rendering software and in Rhino are called decals. KeyShot uses the terminology labels. So go to the labels tab here and click here to add a label, and I have a choice here of adding a texture, a video, or a material. I'll choose texture, and then I'm navigated to the file browser, and I have some PNG files here which are basically white images on a transparent background. And I have one called volume mute, which I will open up. And as soon as I open this up, I see the mapping control here. So I will set this to part and choose Z-axis. And you'll see now that I see the icon. Now, if I have both translate and rotate set here, I can scale this either by holding down Shift and dragging, or of course I can use the sliders here. Now the advantage of using the slider is that my midpoint stays fixed. And I'll uncheck translate, and rotate lets me rotate this around, and I want to rotate through 90 degrees. So if I hold down Shift, this will constrain my rotation to 90 degree increments, making this easier to rotate. And I can just now adjust the size of this image. until I've got something that looks okay. Okay, so this has applied the image. So I'm going to repeat this on the next 4 buttons. So I'll go to Scene, and I'll just go through the first of these, and then we'll skip the last 2. So it's go to Scene, pick the appropriate button, unlink the material, edit the material, labels, add a texture label, choose the appropriate image. In this case, I'm going to align to the part, choose the appropriate axis, the appropriate size, and then click the checkbox when you're done. Okay, so I'll just repeat this for the volume up and the volume down button, and we'll come back when that's done. Okay, so the logos for the buttons are now in place. Now, there was one extra feature with these labels that we need to go into, and that is the fact that if we, for example, look at the first button here and we edit the material, the base material has a roughness value applied to it. This is giving us the texture on the plastic. If we go into the label itself and we switch from label textures to label properties, you'll see that that roughness value is set at 0. So this will mean that these printed logos at the moment appear as being glossy. So if we want to add the same amount of texture as we have to the material, this is where we need to do it. So we can just copy this value from the roughness of the material, and we can paste it into this setting here. And we can also, if we want to be really pedantic about this, we can change the refractive index to be the same as the plastic material. Now, of course, in the real life you might have a slightly different refractive index on here. So this is something in terms of certainly the roughness value that we're going to look at a little bit later on. So I'm just going to repeat that process with these other buttons, and then we'll come back and look at the next step. Okay, so we now have all the buttons with the appropriate amount of roughness applied to the label. Okay, so next up I'm going to put the logo on the top plate. So I'll go to Scene, I'll go to my top plate component, I'll unlink the material and edit the material, go to Labels, add a label. This time I'll choose a PSD file. Now, sometimes you may find that if you have a Photoshop file with transparency, you might get a slightly better result in terms of less fringing, particularly around the edge of the image, than you do with a PNG file. So we're going to add the logo here. Now, if you don't want to resize and rotate at this stage, you can accept the result here, and you can rotate the logo here in the angle. And you can control the size. If you uncheck use DPI for size, this will generally set itself if you use a Photoshop file. So we can just reduce the size here. Okay, so at the moment this is a straightforward printed logo. Let's look at doing something a little bit different with this. If we go to Camera, let's just save this top plate and lock it, and I'll go back to the render one and then switch to the free camera just to zoom into this area here and take a look at this. You can see that these button logos are starting to look quite nice. Now, if we wanted to make this logo look as if it was recessed rather than printed, then we can go to the appropriate material for the top plate. And we can go to labels, and in label textures we can see the various elements here. Because this is a plastic material, we have specular as well as bump and opacity. So I don't want my printed logo this time, so rather than option holding down the left mouse button and dragging, I can just hold down the left mouse button and drag, and I can use that as a bump map. Okay, so I'll just zoom in a little bit here. Now this will give me a positive value, and if I want to make this logo look as though it's recessed, I can slide this slider here till I get a negative value. If I don't have a big enough value here, I can just type in the value that I want and then move the slider from there. Okay, now when you use bump maps like this, you may well see the difference between, for example, a PNG and a PSD file in terms of what you're bringing in. So the better the image quality is, particularly with the bump maps, then the better edge definition you're going to get. Okay, so this is starting to look quite acceptable now. Our printed icons are looking good, and we've got our recessed molded in text for the logo. I just now want to look at doing another enhancement to the buttons. So I'm going to switch to the top plate camera and then create a view on a button from there. What I want to do now is to add a bump map to the actual individual buttons. So if I go to the scene and I go to this button and edit the material, and I go to labels, of course it's possible to have more than one label. So I'll click on the add label and add label texture, and I'm going to use a button bump image here, and I'll use a PNG file and bring this in, and I'll adjust the placement of this and just fine-tune the size of this. And of course at the moment this is just a white image. Now the order of the images is important, so I'll push my logo to the top and we'll work now on the bump. So I will drag what was the diffuse texture onto the bump slot, and you'll see here that because this doesn't have a roughness applied to it, that our button now becomes glossy. I'm also now going to option drag this over to the opacity map, and this will give us a glossy area just for the raised portion and a matte area for the remainder of the button. Okay, I'm just going to go down to the bump here and just increase the height of that, just to accentuate that a little. And let's take a look at what this looks like in our perspective view. Okay, so you can see that this is going to look reasonably convincing. And again, this idea of doing these type of things in KeyShot means that we can experiment a little more freely with these than we might be able to do if we were modeling these inside of Rhino. So I'm going to now repeat this effect onto the other 4 buttons and then come back to you when that's complete. So now we've got the bump added to the buttons, and this is probably all we need to do on the top plate. Now one of the last things I need to do now is just to look at the illuminated ring that sits underneath here. Now one of the things about an emissive material in KeyShot is that there is no ability to add a glossiness level to that, and so what we have here is actually 2 materials that we're going to use. We've got a lens surface, and then underneath that we're going to have the emissive material. So if I go to the scene, and first of all let's just hide the actual lens itself, and you'll see that the emissive material is going to be applied to this part here, which is called light, which just sits underneath that. So I'm going to go to materials and light and emissive, and we'll use the cool emissive to start off with, and then we'll edit this. Want to give this kind of color here, and probably don't want the intensity of this to be too much. I'll drop down this intensity. Now, of course, we're going to vary this intensity dependent on the lighting, but I don't want it to be too much, and actually that is a little bit too dark there, so that looks better. Okay, we can play with this material later on. Okay, so now I go back to scene and turn on the lens, and then the lens I want to make a clear plastic material, and let's try a textured material on this. Okay, and let's maybe go into that material and reduce the roughness of this somewhat. I want to be able to see a bit of reflection on this, but I want it to have a slight bit of roughness to it, so it looks like plastic. So then I go back to the light and let's play with the intensity on this. And then let's go back to camera and render 1 and take a look at what this looks like. Okay, so I think that's starting to look good. So let's do a couple of renders from this. This is the first of the renders that was produced from the scene, and I've just made a couple of changes from the tutorial. And first of all, I retained the sparked finish on the top molding, but I created a glossy finish for the recessed logo, and I created this by using an opacity map. The buttons are pretty much as they were in the tutorial, and I just made a couple of changes on the finish for the black bezel either side of the lens. You can see that we have a nice transparency in the mesh here. We can see the material underneath, and we can see the return edge on the mesh, and overall the image looks pretty nice and convincing. This is a closer shot, and this time we've used a bit of depth of field in KeyShot to concentrate the eye on this button detail here. The depth of field was just set up straight in KeyShot, and indeed the background comes straight out of KeyShot as well. So the only Photoshop contribution here has just been resizing and sharpening. So again, one final image. We have a nice, crisp, clear image that's very easy to create and gives us a good idea of this detail that we put in inside of KeyShot. So that's about all I wanted to cover in this video. Feel free to leave any comments below. If you found this video useful, then please hit the like button, and remember to keep up to date with the latest developments in Rhino for Mac and KeyShot. You can subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch up with you again in the next video.